My daughter skipped my wife, her mom's funeral, for her friend's birthday party. She said, "Mom is gone. She was your wife. Bury her alone. I have other important events to take care of." 1 week later, she came to me in need of my help. She had been thrown out of her husband's house and didn't have anywhere to go. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything. Before then, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story resonates with you, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time is it there. Let me take you back to the beginning. I remember the sound of her heels against the hardwood floor more clearly than the words themselves. Click, click, click. It felt louder than it should have, louder than grief, louder than the silence that followed. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg. I just stood there, holding the folded black tie I had been trying to knot for the last 5 minutes, and watched my only daughter walk out of the house her mother had kept warm for 32 years. I could feel something shift inside me right then, something quiet but permanent. I didn't know what I would do about it yet, but I knew I would not forget that moment. And I knew that one day, she would feel the weight of it. The funeral director called 15 minutes later to confirm we were on schedule. His voice was polite, rehearsed, professionally gentle. "We'll begin promptly at 11, he said. "Your daughter will be seated in the front row, correct?" I looked at the empty hallway where she had just disappeared and cleared my throat. "No," I answered. "There will be one seat in the front row." He paused, just long enough for the silence to become noticeable, before replying, "Understood." That was the first time the reality of burying my wife alone felt official. I told myself there had to be a reason. Some emergency, some obligation she couldn't get out of. When she said important events, I assumed work. Maybe something with her husband's family, something unavoidable. My mind searched for explanations because the alternative, that she simply didn't care, was too sharp to hold. I had spent the last year watching her mother fade from cancer, and even during the worst hospital nights, I believed our daughter would at least stand beside us when it ended. I didn't need comfort from her. I just expected presence. 2 days before the funeral, my wife had held my hand in the hospital room and whispered, "Make sure she's okay." Even then, even with tubes in her arms and her voice barely audible, she was thinking about our daughter. That was who she was. She never stopped being a mother, not even when her own body was shutting down. I had promised her. I said, of course. I meant it. I didn't know that keeping that promise would begin to cost me my dignity. By 9:30 that morning, relatives had started arriving at the church. My sister pulled me aside near the entrance. "Where's she?" she asked softly, already knowing the answer. I shook my head once. She had something important. My sister frowned but didn't push. People whispered. I could feel it. It's strange how grief sharpens your awareness of other people's judgment. Every glance felt loaded. Every hushed conversation felt like it was about me. About us. About the empty space beside me where my daughter should have been standing. During the service, I kept looking at the door. Not because I expected her to burst in dramatically, apologizing for being late. I think I just wanted proof that I had been wrong about her. That she would walk in quietly, slide into the front pew, and squeeze my hand. But the door never opened. The pastor spoke about devotion, about family, about enduring love. I nodded at the appropriate times. I bowed my head when everyone else did. But inside, something cold had started to settle in me, and it wasn't grief alone. When it came time to lower the casket, I stepped forward because there was no one else to stand beside me. The wind was stronger than I expected. It tugged at my jacket and dried my eyes before tears could even fall. I placed a single white rose on the polished wood and whispered goodbye. Not dramatically, not loudly. Just enough for her to hear, if hearing was still something she could do. And as the casket descended, I realized I was not just burying my wife. I was burying the illusion that blood alone guaranteed loyalty. Later that afternoon, back at the house, the silence felt unnatural. Her favorite chair was still angled toward the television. A half-finished knitting project sat on the side table. I picked it up and ran the yarn between my fingers, trying to understand how a house that had once held laughter could feel so hollow in a single day. My phone buzzed. A text from my daughter. "Hope everything went well." I stared at the message for a long time. Not because I didn't know how to respond, but because I was trying to figure out what kind of person writes that sentence to her father on the day of her mother's funeral. I typed back, "It's done." She responded with a thumbs up emoji. That was the moment I stopped trying to excuse her behavior in my own mind. Still, I didn't confront her. Not that day. Grief already felt like a weight pressing on my chest, and I didn't have the energy to fight another battle. I told myself I would talk to her later, when emotions were less raw. I convinced myself that maybe she was handling her grief differently. People process loss in strange ways. That's what I kept telling myself. But even as I said it, I knew it sounded like justification, and I needed to understand it before I could survive it. That evening, my neighbor Mrs. Alvarez knocked gently on the door. She handed me a casserole dish wrapped in foil and hugged me longer than necessary. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. As she pulled back, she hesitated. "I didn't see your daughter today." I forced a tight smile. She had something important. Mrs. Alvarez's expression shifted, but she didn't comment. She just squeezed my hand and left. The door clicked shut, and the house swallowed me again. I walked into the bedroom and opened my wife's closet. Her clothes were still there, arranged by color the way she liked. I pressed my face into one of her sweaters and inhaled what little scent remained. I thought about all the nights she had stayed awake waiting for our daughter to come home safely when she was a teenager. I thought about the arguments we'd had over curfews, about how fiercely my wife had defended her whenever I tried to be strict. "She's young," she would say. "She'll understand one day." I had trusted that one day would come. By midnight, exhaustion replaced tears. I sat at the kitchen table alone, staring at 2 coffee mugs, hers and mine, out of habit. I realized then that grief was not just about missing someone. It was about recalibrating your entire life around their absence. And as I sat there, I understood something else too. My daughter's absence that morning had carved a second hole in my life, one I hadn't anticipated. I didn't know what I would do about it yet, but I knew I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. I went to bed that night with a quiet resolution forming beneath the sadness. I would not chase her for an explanation. I would not beg for empathy. If she believed her important event outweighed burying her mother, then she would have to live with that choice. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't send angry messages. I simply decided to remember. And sometimes, remembering is the beginning of a boundary. I didn't confront her that day, and that delay would cost me. She looked so happy. That was what my sister said when she walked into my kitchen 2 days after the funeral, her phone still in her hand. She didn't sit down right away. She just stood there, staring at me like she wasn't sure whether to show me what she had found. I was rinsing a coffee mug that hadn't been used, my movements slow and automatic, as if routine could anchor me to something solid. When I turned toward her, I already knew. I didn't know how I knew, but I did. "What are you talking about?" I asked, drying my hands carefully, buying time I didn't realize I needed. She swallowed and stepped closer. "I think you should see this." I told myself I was prepared for whatever it was. I wasn't. And by the time I finished looking at those pictures, something inside me that had still been trying to defend her finally went quiet. I didn't react the way my sister expected. I didn't shout. I didn't throw the phone. But in that silence, a line began forming. Thin at first, but permanent. I didn't say it out loud then. I wouldn't for a while. But that was the day I stopped protecting her from the truth of what she had done. The screen showed balloons first. Gold and white, clustered against a restaurant wall I recognized from downtown. Then a cake. 3 tiers, covered in glittering frosting, with sparklers lit on top. And then her, my daughter, wearing a fitted red dress I had never seen before, head tilted back, laughing at something just outside the frame. There were at least 15 people around her, glasses raised, arms wrapped around shoulders. Someone had captioned the photo, "Best birthday ever." So grateful for everyone who showed up. The date stamp was unmistakable. It was the same day I buried my wife. I zoomed in without meaning to. My fingers acted before my mind could catch up. Her makeup was done carefully. Her hair curled. She looked radiant. Not strained. Not distracted. Not like someone who had spent the morning grieving her mother and rushed to another obligation. She looked present. Fully present. That was the detail that undid me. Not that she attended a party, but that she was wholly there. My sister's voice broke through my thoughts. "I'm sorry. I thought you should know." She pulled out a chair and sat across from me, watching my face for cracks. I handed the phone back gently, almost respectfully, as if the images themselves deserved care. That was the important event, I said. Not as a question, as a realization settling into bone. 2 days earlier, when she had walked out of my house in her heels and indifference, I had allowed room for misunderstanding. I had built possible explanations in my head, like scaffolding around a collapsing building. Maybe someone was sick. Maybe there was a crisis. Maybe she couldn't emotionally handle funerals and didn't know how to say that. I had been willing to hold those possibilities because the alternative was too brutal. But now there was no scaffolding left, just open air. My phone buzzed on the counter. A message from a number I didn't immediately recognize. I wiped my eyes, not because I was crying, but because my vision had blurred from staring too long at something that refused to change. The message read, "Saw your daughter at Lucia's birthday dinner. She mentioned she had a family thing earlier. Hope you're holding up." It was from an old family friend who hadn't attended the funeral, but apparently had attended the celebration. Family thing earlier. That phrase echoed in my head longer than it should have. My wife's burial had been reduced to a scheduling inconvenience. Something to fit in before cocktails and cake. Something vague enough to mention, but not significant enough to prioritize. I felt something colder than anger settle in my chest. It wasn't explosive. It was clarifying. I walked into the living room and sat in my wife's chair for the first time since she passed. I had avoided it instinctively, as if sitting there meant accepting that she never would again. But now I lowered myself into it slowly, feeling the worn fabric beneath my hands. I tried to trace the path that had led us here, to this point where our daughter could so easily detach from the woman who had raised her. We had not been perfect parents. I knew that. I had been stricter than my wife preferred. I had believed in discipline, in structure, in earning privileges rather than assuming them. But I had never withheld love, and my wife had loved that girl with a softness I sometimes envied. She attended every school recital, every parent-teacher conference, every small milestone that most people forget within a year. When our daughter scraped her knee at 7, my wife had cried harder than she did. When she failed her first college exam, my wife had driven 2 hours just to sit beside her in silence. And now that same woman had been buried without her child present. "I don't understand it," my sister said quietly. "Even if they weren't close at the end, They were close," I corrected automatically, because that was the truth. There had been distance after she got married, less frequent visits, more holidays spent with her husband's family, but there had never been hostility. No shouting matches, no estrangement, just gradual drift, the kind you assume can always be corrected later. I picked up my phone and opened her social media profile myself, even though I knew I shouldn't. The pictures were public, more angles of the same night. A short video clip where everyone sang loudly and off-key while she leaned over to blow out candles. She looked straight into the camera at one point and smiled, a wide, unguarded smile I hadn't seen directed at me in years. There was no mention of her mother anywhere on that page. Not a tribute, not a black ribbon emoji. Not even a vague acknowledgement that something irreversible had happened that day. It was as if the funeral existed in a separate universe, one she had opted out of entirely. By that afternoon, word had spread among relatives. My cousin called. "Is it true?" she asked bluntly. I didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Yes," I replied. She sighed heavily. "I'm sorry." I could hear judgment tucked beneath the sympathy, though I wasn't sure if it was aimed at her or at me. Perhaps both. Family narratives are rarely clean. I didn't call my daughter. Not that day. Not the next. I wanted to hear remorse before I demanded it. I wanted her to reach out and say, "Dad, I made a mistake." But instead, she sent me a message that evening. "Hope you're doing okay. I've been really busy." Busy. The word felt almost obscene in context. I stared at the screen for several minutes before typing back. I saw the pictures. I didn't elaborate. I didn't accuse. I simply stated that I knew. Her reply came 10 minutes later. It was Lucia's 30th. "I committed months ago. You know how important friendships are." I read it twice. Then a third time. I waited for the follow-up message that would soften it. It never came. That was when the truth settled fully. She did not see her choice as wrong. Not as a mistake. not as a lapse in judgment. She saw it as a scheduling conflict she had navigated logically, and that realization hurt more than the absence itself. Because absence born from confusion can be repaired. Absence born from indifference cannot. I walked outside just before sunset, needing air that didn't carry the weight of that house. Mrs. Alvarez was watering her plants again. She glanced at me gently. "How are you today?" she asked. I considered lying. Instead, I said, I found out what her important event was. She paused, reading between words. Oh, that single syllable carried more understanding than any speech could. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table again, but something was different. Grief was still there. It would be for a long time, but it had been joined by clarity. I had spent 2 days trying to protect my daughter from the harshest interpretation of her actions. I had told myself she was overwhelmed, distracted, emotionally immature. But I could no longer pretend this was about coping styles. It was about priorities. And for the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to think a thought that frightened me. Maybe I had been too available, too forgiving, too ready to excuse behavior that should have been confronted years ago. I didn't know yet what that meant for the future. I didn't make any declarations that night. I didn't draft ultimatums. But I stopped defending her in my own heart. 2 days after I buried my wife, I realized I had also buried an illusion. And illusions, once laid to rest, don't rise again. Stop making me look bad. People are talking. That was the first sentence she sent me 4 days after I saw the pictures. No greeting. No acknowledgement of what had happened. Just accusation. I read it while sitting in the quiet of the living room, the late afternoon sun cutting across the carpet in long, thin lines. For a moment, I genuinely wondered if she had texted the wrong person. Because surely, after everything, she wouldn't lead with that. But she did. And as I stared at those words glowing on my phone screen, I understood something that felt heavier than grief. She wasn't worried about my pain. She was worried about her image. That realization didn't explode inside me. It settled. And once it settled, I knew a reckoning was coming. Not loud, not dramatic, but deliberate. I hadn't acted yet, but I had begun considering what accountability would look like. I didn't respond immediately. I set the phone down on the coffee table and let the silence stretch. The house was still carrying the faint scent of the lilies people had sent after the funeral. Some of them had already begun to wilt. I hadn't thrown them out yet. It felt too symbolic. Like discarding them would mean discarding the last visible proof that my wife had been here. The phone buzzed again. I didn't do anything wrong. I was there for Mom when she was sick. I just couldn't handle the funeral. There it was. A justification carefully framed as vulnerability. I read it slowly, letting each word land without rushing to respond. If she had started there, if she had led with honesty instead of defensiveness, I might have met her halfway. But the sequence mattered. The order of priorities mattered. And she had revealed hers without realizing it. I typed back. "You told me you had an important event." Her reply came quickly. "It was important. Lucia is like family to me." I stared at that sentence longer than I should have. Like family. The irony was almost surgical in its precision. I thought about the months my wife had spent in and out of hospitals, about the nights she had slept upright because lying flat made breathing harder. I thought about the way she had asked for our daughter when the pain medication blurred her awareness. And now I was reading that someone else's birthday dinner had been equally weighted on the scale. Before I could sink too deeply into that thought, there was a knock at the door. It was my brother-in-law, my wife's older cousin, who had helped organize parts of the service. He stepped inside with a concerned look. "I just got off the phone with your aunt," he said carefully. "Your daughter told her you're angry and telling people she abandoned the funeral." I blinked. "I haven't told anyone anything." He nodded slowly. "That's what I figured." "But she's saying you're making her out to be heartless." The audacity of it almost made me laugh, but not in a way that carried humor. It was the kind of laugh that escapes when disbelief outweighs outrage. I hadn't called relatives to expose her. I hadn't posted cryptic messages online. I had answered direct questions with simple truth. And somehow, that truth had become an attack in her narrative. After he left, I sat back down and reread our text thread. There was something clarifying about seeing it all in one place. She wasn't asking how I was sleeping. She wasn't asking whether the house felt empty. She wasn't apologizing for not standing beside me while we lowered her mother into the ground. She was managing perception. I typed again, slower this time. I haven't made you look like anything. Your choices speak for themselves. There was a longer pause before she answered. Then, you're being dramatic. Funerals are for the living. Mom wouldn't have wanted me to miss something important. That line struck deeper than the others. Because she was invoking her mother now, using her memory as a shield. I closed my eyes and leaned back in the chair. My wife had once told me, during one of our quieter evenings after chemo, if I go before you, make sure she knows I loved her. She had never once suggested that love excused absence. I realized then that we weren't arguing about logistics. We were operating from entirely different moral frameworks. To her, presence was optional if inconvenience outweighed sentiment. To me, presence was the bare minimum expression of respect. The phone buzzed again before I could reply. And honestly, Dad, people process grief differently. You can't judge me for that. There it was again, the layering of justification over deflection. I considered the possibility that she truly believed what she was saying. That maybe she had constructed a version of events where her decision was not only acceptable, but mature. That idea unsettled me more than outright cruelty would have. Because cruelty at least acknowledges harm. 2 days later, I ran into an old coworker at the grocery store. He placed a hand on my shoulder and said softly, "I'm sorry for your loss. I heard it was just you at the burial." The sentence was gentle, but the implication wasn't. Word had spread beyond family. And every time someone expressed sympathy, I could feel her growing resentment toward me. Resentment I hadn't earned. That evening, she called instead of texting. I let it ring twice before answering. "Dad, why are you telling people I chose a party over Mom?" "I'm not telling people anything," I replied evenly. "They're asking why you weren't there." "Well, you could defend me." The expectation in her voice stunned me. Not because she wanted protection, that had always been our dynamic, but because she still assumed it was automatic. "Defend you from what?" I asked quietly. "From judgment," she snapped. "From everyone thinking I'm a terrible daughter." I took a breath before responding. I didn't create that thought. Silence stretched between us. For a moment, I wondered if she would finally step into accountability. Instead, she shifted again. "You're making this bigger than it is. Mom is gone. Being at a cemetery doesn't change that." There are moments in life when clarity arrives not as comfort, but as incision. This was one of them. I realized that if I continued absorbing this behavior without resistance, I would be complicit in my own erosion. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult her. But something inside me began closing, not out of revenge, but out of preservation. "I won't argue with you," I said calmly. "You made your choice." "That's it," she challenged. "For now," I answered. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet house and let the weight of that conversation settle. I wasn't angry in the way people expect anger to look. I wasn't pacing or shouting. I was evaluating. For years, I had told myself that small disappointments were part of parenthood, that children grow in uneven ways, that maturity comes eventually. But this wasn't a small disappointment. It was a declaration of values. The next morning, I called an attorney I had worked with years ago when we drafted our original will. I didn't make any changes that day. I didn't sign anything. I simply asked questions. Hypotheticals. What happens if circumstances shift? What if trust erodes? The conversation was practical, almost sterile, but beneath it was something personal taking shape. I hadn't made any decisions yet, but I had started considering them. By the end of that week, relatives had stopped asking where she had been. The story had solidified in quiet understanding, and I realized something unsettling. I was no longer rushing to repair her reputation in private conversations. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I refused to distort reality. I didn't confront her again that week. I didn't demand apologies. I watched. I listened. I observed how easily she framed herself as misunderstood rather than accountable. And with each interaction, the line inside me grew darker, more defined. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't plotting dramatic ultimatums. But I was recalibrating my role in her life. And recalibration, once begun, rarely reverses. I didn't know then how soon I would be forced to act. but I could feel it coming. "Dad, open the door. Please." It was just past 7 in the evening when I heard the pounding. Not a polite knock. Not the measured tap of someone uncertain. It was urgent. Desperate. The kind of knocking that makes neighbors glance through curtains. I had been sitting at the dining table, sorting through unopened mail, when the sound echoed through the house. For a brief second, I thought something terrible had happened. I moved quickly toward the door, my chest tightening, not with fear, but with instinct. When I opened it, she was standing there with 2 large suitcases and swollen eyes. Her mascara had smudged beneath both lids, and her hair, usually styled carefully, was pulled into a loose knot that looked rushed and uneven. The red dress from the birthday photos was gone, replaced with jeans and a wrinkled sweater. She looked smaller somehow, not physically, but diminished. And as I stood there taking in the image of my only daughter on my doorstep, I felt something heavy press against the inside of my ribs. Not softness, not quite anger, something steadier. "He threw me out," she said before I could speak. "I don't have anywhere to go." I stepped aside so she could enter, but I didn't reach for her luggage. I didn't wrap her in an embrace. I simply moved out of the doorway because I was raised not to leave anyone outside at night. As she wheeled the suitcases across the threshold, I had the strangest awareness that this moment would determine more than just where she slept. I didn't react immediately, but I knew something irreversible was forming. She dropped the suitcases near the staircase and collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "He said I was selfish," she muttered through uneven breaths. "He said I only think about myself." The irony hovered in the room, thick and unspoken. I closed the door quietly and leaned against it for a moment, watching her cry. Part of me wanted to kneel in front of her and smooth her hair the way her mother used to. That reflex didn't disappear just because I was hurt. Parenthood doesn't switch off like a light. But alongside that reflex was another awareness, one that had been growing steadily since the funeral. 2 days after I buried my wife alone, I learned where I stood in her priorities. For days later, she asked me to defend her image. And now, 1 week after the burial, she was asking for refuge. I didn't believe in coincidence. I believed in patterns. "What happened?" I asked finally, my voice even. She lifted her head, eyes red. "We argued. About everything. About money. About how I handled Mom's funeral. He said it showed who I really am." She wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater. "He said if I could treat you like that, I'd treat him worse." I absorbed that slowly. Not because I needed time to understand it, but because I needed time not to react impulsively. Her husband had drawn the same conclusion I had, only he had reached it faster. And instead of apologizing or reflecting, she had been pushed out. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it at first, but when it buzzed again, I glanced down. It was a message from an unfamiliar number. "This is Mark. Tell her she can't come back unless she apologizes. I'm serious." Her husband. I read it once and slid the phone back into my pocket without responding. "He texted you, didn't he?" she asked, eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes," I replied. "What did he say?" "That he's serious." She let out a sharp breath, half scoff, half sob. "He's overreacting." Everyone is overreacting. It was just a funeral. There it was again. That phrase. Just a funeral. I felt something in me align with uncomfortable clarity. It wasn't grief that had fractured this family. It was her minimization of it. I walked into the kitchen and poured 2 glasses of water. When I returned, she had started pacing. "I can't stay with Lucia," she continued. "Her apartment is too small, and it would be awkward. I just need a few weeks, until things calm down. A few weeks." The assumption of availability settled between us like an unspoken contract. For most of her life, I would have signed it without reading the terms. I had always believed that children, even grown ones, should feel safe returning home. But safety without accountability isn't refuge. It's permission. 2 days earlier, I had stood by a graveside alone while she toasted champagne. That image did not fade simply because she was crying now. "You said Lucia is like family," I said quietly. She stopped pacing and stared at me. "What does that have to do with anything? You prioritized her birthday over your mother's funeral." Her jaw tightened. "We're not doing this right now. When are we doing it?" I asked, not raising my voice. Silence stretched between us, thick and brittle. She looked away first. "I'm not here to argue," she muttered. "I just need help." I sat down in the armchair opposite the couch and folded my hands together. I had imagined this scenario in abstract during the past week, wondering what I would do if she ever needed something significant from me. I hadn't known the timing would be this precise. 1 week, 7 days. The symmetry was almost cruel. "I helped you your entire life," I began slowly. "Through school, through your wedding, through the down payment on that house." She flinched slightly at that, as if bringing up finances was inappropriate. "But reality doesn't become impolite just because it's inconvenient. I buried your mother alone," I continued, the words steady. "And you told me to do it because you had more important events." She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. For the first time since entering the house, she looked uncertain rather than defensive. "I can't pretend that didn't happen," I said. "I can't pretend it doesn't matter." Her eyes filled again, but I noticed something different now. Not remorse, but frustration, as if the obstacle in her path wasn't her own decision, but my unwillingness to ignore it. "So what?" she snapped. "You're going to punish me? Is that what this is?" The question hung there, sharp and accusing. I examined it internally before answering. Was this punishment? Revenge? Or was it the first boundary I had ever truly enforced? "This isn't about punishment," I replied carefully. "It's about consequence." She laughed bitterly. "You're choosing now to grow a backbone?" After everything, the insult landed, but it didn't penetrate. Because she was partially right. I was choosing now, not out of pride, not out of cruelty, but because grief had clarified what tolerance had obscured. My phone buzzed again, this time from my sister. "Is she with you?" the message read. Word traveled fast in families, especially during crises. I didn't respond yet. "I don't have anywhere else," she said, voice breaking slightly. "You do," I answered. "Go to your friend. The important one." The words were measured, not shouted, not delivered with dramatic emphasis, just stated. Her face changed then, not into sorrow, but disbelief. "You can't be serious." "I am. You're my father. I was your father at the cemetery too." That line settled heavily in the air. She stared at me as if trying to determine whether this was a temporary outburst or something more permanent. I held her gaze without hostility, but without retreat. A car drove slowly past the house, headlights briefly illuminating the living room through the curtains. I wondered which neighbor was watching. I wondered what story would circulate tomorrow. And I realized something surprising. I didn't care. "You're choosing pride over your own daughter," she whispered. "No," I said quietly. "I'm choosing self-respect." The distinction mattered, not just for her, but for me. She grabbed the handle of one suitcase abruptly. "Fine, I'll go." I didn't move to stop her, not because it didn't hurt. It did, but because stepping aside was the only honest action left. As she reached the door, she turned back once. "Mom would be ashamed of you." The sentence sliced cleanly, but not deeply, because I knew my wife. I knew her compassion, yes, but I also knew her sense of fairness. And I believed, perhaps for the first time with complete certainty, that loving someone did not require accepting their disregard. "I don't think she would," I replied calmly. She opened the door and stepped out into the night, dragging the suitcases behind her. The sound of wheels on concrete echoed longer than it should have. When the door closed again, the house returned to silence. But it was a different kind of silence than the one after the funeral. This one felt intentional. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door she had just exited. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. I wasn't triumphant. I was steady. And in that steadiness, I knew what I was going to do next. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" The attorney's voice was calm, professional, almost detached, but the question carried weight. We were sitting across from each other in his office, a polished wooden desk between us and a stack of documents laid out neatly like quiet evidence. He wasn't challenging me. He wasn't judging. He was doing his job. Still, the way he asked it made the moment feel ceremonial, like I was about to close a door that had once been left intentionally unlocked. I looked down at the page where my daughter's name appeared in clean, typed font, listed as sole beneficiary. For years, that line had symbolized continuity, legacy. the assumption that what her mother and I built would naturally flow to her. But now it looked different. Not wrong, just outdated. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch long enough to ensure that what I was about to say came from clarity, not emotion. Because this wasn't anger. Anger fades. This felt permanent. Yes, I said finally. I'm certain. He nodded once and slid the revised document toward me. The pen felt heavier than it should have. As I positioned it over the signature line, I had a brief, vivid memory of the day my wife and I first drafted our will. Our daughter had just gotten engaged. We were sitting in this same office, smiling at each other like parents who believed their hard work had culminated in something stable. We had joked about spoiling future grandchildren. We had imagined holidays in a house filled with noise. We had not imagined this. 2 days after the funeral, I learned where I stood in her priorities. 1 week later, she stood at my door expecting shelter without accountability. And now, just over 2 weeks since I buried my wife alone, I was drawing a line that should have been drawn years ago. The sequence wasn't impulsive. It was cumulative. I signed my name. The scratch of ink against paper sounded louder than it should have. When I finished, I felt neither triumph nor devastation. Just a strange, quiet equilibrium. The attorney gathered the papers carefully and stamped them. The sound of the stamp landing felt final in a way words never could. If you ever wish to revise this again, he said gently, you can. I understood what he meant. People reconcile. Families heal. But reconciliation requires recognition. And I had not seen that from her. Not once. I'll let you know, I replied. As I stepped out of the office, my phone buzzed. A message from my sister. She's telling everyone you turned her away. I stared at the screen for a moment before typing back. I did. There was no need to elaborate. The truth didn't require embellishment. By that afternoon, my daughter had begun calling relatives. I knew because 3 different people reached out to me within hours. An aunt told me I was being too harsh. A cousin suggested grief was clouding my judgment. One even implied that cutting her off financially would destroy her future. I listened to each of them without raising my voice. I didn't defend myself aggressively. I simply repeated the same sentence. She chose her priorities. I'm choosing mine. That night, she called me directly. I can't believe you told people you refused to let me stay, she said, skipping any greeting. I didn't tell anyone, I replied calmly. You did. There was a pause, then a shift in tone. So that's it. You're just done with me. I considered the question carefully before answering. I'm done pretending your actions don't matter. She exhaled sharply. You're punishing me because I missed one event. It wasn't one event, I corrected. It was your mother's funeral. Silence filled the line. I could hear traffic in the background, the faint hum of the world continuing normally around her. For a moment, I wondered where she was staying. Whether Lucia had made space after all. Whether her husband had reconsidered. But I didn't ask, because asking would reopen the door I had just closed in that attorney's office. You're being dramatic, she muttered again, clinging to the same defense she had used before. No, I said quietly. I'm being consistent. That was the distinction she refused to see. For years, I had absorbed small slights, dismissed minor disrespect, covered financial gaps she and her husband created through impulsive spending. I had told myself that helping her was part of being a father. But somewhere along the way, help had become expectation. And expectation had become entitlement. I needed you, she said suddenly, her voice cracking in a way that almost softened me. And I needed you, I replied. At the cemetery. The words hung between us, undeniable. She didn't respond immediately. When she did, her tone had hardened again. You're choosing money over your daughter. The accusation was predictable, but it still landed with a dull weight. I took a slow breath before answering. No, I'm choosing to leave my assets to someone who values what built them. Who? Some charity? She scoffed. Possibly. The truth was, I hadn't finalized where everything would go, but I knew it wouldn't default to her simply because she shared my blood. Blood is biology. Loyalty is behavior. 2 days later, I received confirmation from the bank that beneficiary designations had been updated. The emails were sterile, transactional, devoid of emotion. Yet each notification felt like another brick in a wall I hadn't intended to build, but now needed. That afternoon, Mrs. Alvarez stopped by again, this time with no casserole, just concern. I heard she came by last week, she said gently. News traveled faster than I expected. I nodded once. She needed somewhere to stay. Mrs. Alvarez studied my face carefully. And? She asked. And I told her to go where she said family was. Mrs. Alvarez didn't gasp. She didn't scold. She simply nodded slowly. Sometimes love looks like letting someone face themselves, she said quietly before leaving. Her words lingered longer than she did. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table again, the same place where I had spent countless nights replaying the funeral in my head. But this time, I wasn't replaying grief. I was reviewing resolve. I asked myself the question no one else had. Was I doing this out of spite? I examined it honestly. Spite would have felt hot, impulsive, loud. What I felt was steady, measured, painfully calm. This wasn't revenge. It was boundary. I thought about my wife again, not in the hospital, not in decline, but in the kitchen years ago, flour dusting her hands as she baked something unnecessarily elaborate for a school fundraiser. She had always believed in second chances. But she also believed in accountability. Love doesn't erase consequence, she once told our daughter after a particularly reckless teenage decision. It just means I'll still be here after you face it. I was still here, but I was no longer cushioning the fall. By the end of the week, my daughter's narrative had solidified. I was wicked, cold, selfish. She told relatives I cared more about pride than family. I didn't correct her publicly. I didn't counterattack. Because people who wanted the truth could see it, and those who didn't were not my responsibility. There was one final conversation I knew I had to have with her. Not about money, not about temporary housing, but about identity, about what it meant to call someone your parent while disregarding them entirely. I wasn't looking for reconciliation. I wasn't even looking for apology anymore. I was looking for closure. And once I said what needed to be said, there would be no returning to the version of us that existed before that funeral. I had signed the papers. Now I had to sign the boundary. You're dead to me. She said it before I could even finish opening the door. It was late afternoon, the sky dim and heavy with the kind of gray that made everything feel suspended. I hadn't expected her to show up in person again. After the phone calls, after the accusations, I assumed distance would stretch naturally between us. But there she was, standing on the porch, arms crossed tightly over her chest, eyes burning with something sharper than sadness. I didn't respond immediately. I just looked at her, really looked at her. Not as the woman who skipped her mother's funeral, not as the one who told relatives I was wicked, but as the child I once carried on my shoulders at the county fair. The toddler who used to refuse to sleep unless her mother hummed off-key lullabies. That history didn't disappear. It hovered behind her anger like a ghost neither of us acknowledged. I'm not dead, I said calmly. I'm right here. She let out a bitter laugh. You might as well be. You've cut me off. You turned your back on me when I needed you. The irony had stopped surprising me by then. It didn't sting the way it once would have. It simply confirmed what I already understood. In her version of events, she was always the injured party. Accountability was something that happened to other people. I didn't turn my back on you. I replied evenly. I stood still. You walked away first. Her jaw tightened. Because I missed one funeral? There it was again, the reduction. The minimization that turned something sacred into something logistical. I stepped aside and gestured for her to come in, not out of warmth, but out of habit. She hesitated, then entered. This time, she carried no suitcases. No visible vulnerability. Only confrontation. The living room felt smaller with her inside it. Tighter, as if the walls were aware that something final was about to be spoken. You changed your will, she said bluntly. Yes, I answered. You actually did it. I did. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. Over a party. No, I corrected gently. Over what that party represented. She rolled her eyes, but I continued before she could interrupt. It represented your priorities. It represented how easily you detached from your mother's final goodbye. It represented how quickly you framed yourself as the victim when people noticed. She opened her mouth, then stopped. For a moment, I saw something flicker behind her anger. Uncertainty, perhaps. But it hardened quickly. You're unbelievable, she snapped. Do you know how humiliating this has been? Everyone thinks I'm some kind of monster. I didn't tell them that, I replied. Your actions did. Silence filled the room, thick and uncomfortable. Outside, a car drove past slowly, tires crunching against gravel. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life continuing while ours unraveled. I needed you, she said again, softer this time. Mark kicked me out. I had nowhere. And I needed you. I responded quietly. At the cemetery. The repetition wasn't dramatic. It wasn't meant to wound. It was simply the truth we kept circling. She looked away first. You're choosing pride over blood, she whispered. No, I said steadily. I'm choosing dignity over denial. That was the heart of it. For years, I had denied the pattern, denied the entitlement, denied the way she treated my support as a resource rather than a relationship. The funeral wasn't the beginning. It was the moment the pattern became undeniable. You're not my father anymore, she said suddenly, her voice shaking, not with sorrow, but with fury. I will always be your father by blood, I replied, but I will not continue being your safety net while you disregard me. I won't fund your life. I won't absorb your consequences. I won't pretend what you did didn't matter. Her eyes filled, not theatrically, but genuinely. And for a brief second, I wondered if this was the moment remorse would finally surface. Instead, she shook her head. You're cold, she whispered. No, I said. I'm clear. Clarity can look like coldness to people who benefit from confusion. You'll regret this, she added, her voice rising again. When you're alone. I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it revealed the assumption beneath her argument. That being alone was worse than being disrespected. That solitude was a punishment rather than a possibility. I've already been alone, I said quietly. I stood alone at your mother's grave. I survived that. The room felt very still after that. She looked around the house, the familiar furniture, the photographs still lining the walls. Her gaze lingered on one picture in particular, the three of us at her college graduation, arms linked, smiling into the future we thought was stable. You're really done? She asked, her voice smaller now. I'm done pretending, I replied. There it was. Not dramatic, not explosive, just final. She nodded once, sharply, as if sealing something in her own mind. Then she turned and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she paused without turning around. I hope it was worth it, she said. I didn't answer, because peace isn't something you justify to someone who thrives on chaos. The door closed, and the house settled into silence again, but not the hollow silence of loss. This was different, intentional, chosen. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, my hands steady. I didn't collapse into tears. I didn't second-guess the decision. Grief still lived here. I still missed my wife in ways that surprised me daily. But alongside that grief was something new, self-respect. I had spent years believing that unconditional love meant unconditional access. That being a father required endless tolerance. But love without boundaries becomes permission. And permission without accountability becomes erosion. I wasn't better off because I was alone. I was better off because I had stopped betraying myself. That night, I sat in my wife's chair again and looked at the quiet room. I imagined telling her everything. Imagined explaining the decision. And in that imagined conversation, I didn't feel shame. I felt steadiness. Some people will say blood should outweigh everything. That family must endure no matter the cost. But loyalty isn't inherited. It's practiced. I had practiced mine for decades. Now, I was practicing something else. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been pushed too far and had to choose dignity over blood, let me know in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if you believe boundaries are sometimes the bravest form of love, make sure to like this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more real stories about family, betrayal, and finally standing up for yourself. Click on the link in the description to support our work. Because sometimes, walking alone isn't abandonment. It's freedom. See you soon in the next story.